Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Outdoors video. I'm at the British Museum. This is going to be quite a different kind of video. I'm very interested all of a sudden after the previous video at Avebury. A couple of discussions I had in the comments on that video about what did the people of Neolithic Britain drink. I'm not interested in water or milk or whatever. We're talking about booze here. What did the Neolithic people of Britain drink to celebrate or just to pass the time? I'm pretty well known for enjoying sitting in a stone circle with a bottle of Gevrey Chambertin, but that's probably not a very authentic experience. And we're going to talk through with hopefully some B-roll of artifacts that may be tenuously related that I've taken inside the British Museum. And we'll talk through what are the likely beverages that the people of Neolithic Britain would have enjoyed. I imagine the acoustics are probably terrible in here, or maybe they're great, I don't know. We're going to start in the Middle East. There is evidence of malting going back at least 13,000 years. That's the process of partially germinating barley to start to extract the sugars from it. The figurine on the right there is Hathor, who is the Egyptian goddess of, amongst other things, drunkenness. We're taking a detour to Iran in this is around the 8th century BC. It's a jug with a spout, has a sort of stand for a brazier underneath it. The interpretation there says the usage is unknown. There's a quern for grinding grain, or could be part of the brewing process. That could be malted barley. So perhaps we need to start at the start. What is actually necessary to make alcohol? And it's pretty simple on the surface of things. You need sugar, and then you need some yeast to ferment, turn it into alcohol. Now, both of those things sound like easy commodities to come by in the modern age, but back in the Neolithic, perhaps wasn't as available as it is today. One thing that was surprising to me was that Malus domestica was introduced. That's the common apple, the eatable, edible apple, was introduced to the British Isles by the Romans. So, you know, I like to think of cider as a ancient British drink, but it couldn't really have predated the Romans. We did have wild crab apples, and perhaps we'll come back to those later, but it's apparently really quite difficult to make cider purely from crab apples. Modern recipes tend to suggest adding sugar or mix crab apples with regular apples. So I think you'd have had a hard time, given the sugar levels in crab apples, making them ferment without adding something else. And wine, of course, is a Roman introduction. So what are we left with? There was no cider, no wine, unlikely to have been able to make any kind of alcohol from other wild fruits available in Neolithic Britain, pre-Roman Britain, or the Bronze Age as well, due to the sugar levels. So really we're down to two options. The first of those is mead, which often seems to be associated with things like the summer solstice at Avebury, and has these kind of pagan, sort of ancient British associations. And certainly you could make mead from wild honey. I think beekeeping only came to Britain later, perhaps pre-Roman. So you know, the supply of honey from wild bees would have been pretty small, and that may have been something that was made during the Neolithic era. And I think there is occasional evidence, archaeological evidence, of beeswax remains being found in pottery shards, which could possibly suggest the use of honey to make mead. But it was likely to only ever be available in very small quantities, and maybe that was a drink more of the elite. It seems unlikely that that could ever have been a drink of the masses. So we are left probably with just one option, an available source of sugar that can be fermented. And we know, of course, that in the Neolithic, farming arrived in the British Isles, and they were growing grains, various types of wheat and barley. Barley, of course, given the right processing, can be turned into ale. Here at the Plough near the British Museum, and coincidentally I met Timothy Spall here. He gave up his table for me and my daughter when she was just a baby. What a gentleman. Cheers. So the expert here is a researcher from Manchester University called Mead, who has done, I think, about 2 decades of research into how beer may have been made during the Neolithic, including some reconstructive archaeology, some experimental archaeology of actually using primitive tools from that era to create beer, or ale, I should probably say, to be more accurate. And the key thing is in malting. That's how you can convert grain, which is basically starchy and not useful for fermentation, into something that you can ferment. Malting is a sort of partial germination of the grains, the barley grains, that causes enzymes to kick into action and start to convert the starch in the grain into sugar. And then there is a second process of mashing, whereby you steep the malted barley in warm water, and that again reactivates those enzymes and creates more sugars. So eventually you get a sweet liquid called the wort that you can then add yeast to, turning to beer. And Merrin's work has proved that that was all very possible with tools and equipment that they would have had during the Neolithic era. And there is archaeological evidence for this process having taken place various places around the world. The final piece of the puzzle for me was, where did the yeast come from? So during the brewing process, you can sort of capture and reuse the yeast that you've introduced. You can sort of skim the froth and then reintroduce that into your next batch of brewing. But you still need some kind of yeast as a starting point. So with cider, you can get away with, actually with grapes, you can get away with just the ambient wild yeasts that gather around the skin of the fruit. But I don't think you'd get any wild yeast from barley. But this is possibly where those crab apples come back into it again, because crab apples, the skins, do have wild yeast. Mead mentions a site of what she believes to be a Neolithic malting house at Balbride in Aberdeenshire, near Aberdeen. And reading through the site notes for Balbride, it's interesting to see that in amongst all the charred remains of grains found at the site were also crab apples. So I mean, that could have just been coincidence. Perhaps this was a combined grain and fruit store, although why store crab apples, because they're not particularly edible. So that suggests to me that that's at least one possible route. Some sort of wild yeast could be introduced into this brewing process and then gradually refined over time, I imagine. So I would say next time you're at Avebury or elsewhere celebrating a solstice or an equinox, and you want to have an authentic drink of the era, then possibly Mead is still quite valid, but that does sort of put you amongst the elite of that era. Probably the I don't know, sort of clan chieftains and the high priests or whatever. But if you want to enjoy the Neolithic drinking experience in a more sort of humble and down-to-earth way, I suggest a pint of ale. Cheers.